Today we discuss
malt, milling,
and mashing.
Hey everybody, hopefully you're doing well today. That was the full range of Mills Kids minus the oldest. That was Joseph, Isaac, and Therese. I feel like that was one of our best efforts for opening. I don't know if I'm ever going to beat the Star Wars hologram version of Isaac. Just coming at the screen and being all tough. But anyways, as we mentioned, we will be discussing malt milling and mashing today. And this is an exciting one for me because we're really starting to get into the real nuts and bolts processes that I do every day in the brew house, and that we will be performing in class and taking steps towards that with this upcoming lab. This is a cool one. What I'm going to have attached in the description of this video, hopefully, I'll figure out a way to do it, is there's going to be some still pictures that I have you pull up in separate windows to be able to review with me. Every time I try to insert pictures into the video, it scrolls down them. It doesn't stay solid on the screen, and I've tried to make that work, and it won't. And quite frankly, I'm not going to spend any more time on it right now. So I'm just going to post some links to some images in the description of this video. And yeah. So kind of to foreshadow this week's lab and kind of set that up a little bit. In this week's lab, we're going to be doing a wide range of starch conversion tests, some small mashes, where we're going to be attempting to convert starch to sugar. And we're basically going to be doing some other steeping things where we take some specialty malts that don't actually need to be converted, but we want to get their flavors and aromas into the water, into the wort at that point. So we'll be doing some playing around with that, and it should be a good time. So this lecture is going to be really key to understanding what we're trying to do big picture with this stuff. All right. You will need your text. At least I highly suggest you have your text as we go through this today. And we're going to be in chapter 6. And we're going to handle this the way we have some other times, where it's going to be a little bit of a guided reading. But it's going to be really important that there's going to be some phrases and some things that I change that are really going to be the things that I'm looking for on your midterm and then consequently your final. So make sure that you're taking notes on that stuff. And there's some things that I do to simplify the concepts, because the text can be a bit science heavy, and that's great. But I do also want to break it down to a practical standpoint as well. Okay, so we'll be in chapter 6, which is page 121 of volume 1 of your text. And the first thing that we're going to be looking at is this idea of question number 1. What is the objective of brew house operation? It's going to be on your midterm. You want to know this information. What I'm going to do is we're just going to read through it, follow along with me, and then I'm going to start pulling out some key points and adjusting a couple of things for you. First of all, it says the objective of the brew house operation is the same in every brewery, regardless of the system employed. Then it goes into 5 steps. It says step 1 is the solubilization of the primary components of malted barley. And then this is the key, in the conversion during mashing of starch to an assortment of sugars. Okay, so this first step is converting starch to sugar in the mash tun. All right. Second step is separation. Your book says extract. I would like you to use the term wort. Extract might be a bit technically more appropriate, but really, when we have a brew day, it's called wort production. Okay, wort is the pre-fermented sugary liquid that we're going to be producing. It's like that pre-beer, right? So when it says separation of the wort from the insoluble contents of the insoluble components, meaningly the spent grain. Okay, we're going to use that term spent grain for all of the malt and other grains that we have in the mash tun once we've rinsed as much sugar as we can out of them. Okay, that is then spent grain. To review that concept again, the second step is separating the wort from the spent grain. All right. What I want you to do is I want you to look up, pull up the one picture of it's a homebrew setup. It's basically one of the orange water coolers. And what it has at the bottom of the orange water cooler, you can tell that they just emptied the mash tun because you can see a lot of grain sticking to the outside of it. But there's this metal dome on the bottom of it. And if you look closely enough, you can see that there's a lot of small holes. All right. And what that's called is called the false bottom. All right. It's meant to hold up solids, which is your grist or your grain in this situation. And then there's a space beneath it. The idea is that you're going to run the liquid in the mash tun out through that screen to filter out all of the grain. All right. That's kind of one of the big keys. If you go ahead and then open up the professional brewer mash tun picture, it's a little bit more detailed and looks a little bit more like what I ran at Crankers and some other places. This mash tun has a rake in it. All right, it's kind of see-through on the sides, and you see like there's this curtain of arms pointing straight down toward the bottom, and that rotates. All right, and so all you do in that situation is if you look at the top, there's an entrance point for water and for grain. And the great thing about mashing in when you have a rake is you do not have to take 6 to 1,200 pounds of grain, add it to the mash tun manually, meaning picking it up and dumping it in, and then stirring it with a paddle. All right. There are some brewers that will say that you're not actually brewing unless you're using a paddle or stirring the mash yourself. Those are the people that usually just don't have rakes and they feel bitter about it. But rakes are really nice because number one, it takes some labor out of it for you. All right. When we're making the size batches of beer that we're going to be making in class, it's no problem to stir in 10, 15 pounds of grain into something. But when you are handling a large volume like that, it wears on your body. Listen, I'm 40. I hope that at some point, like my long-term brewing career, I get to a point to where I have rakes again in my mash tun because it saves your body. All right, it's a very physical job, and anything that you can take away from that process, I think, is probably good. The other thing, aside from the fact that it's a labor reducer for the brewer, you're going to get a more consistent mixture of the hot water or liquor, hot liquor, brewing water, and the grain. Okay. And I think that's really important, right? Because what you want to have is this uniform grain bed that you're working with. You don't want deep divots in it and different things like that. You want it to be nice and uniform, and it just makes the whole brew day easier when you're like that. And you're going to get the most sugar out of your grain. All right. Now, continuing to look at this professional style mash tun, just below the rakes, you can see that there is a bottom, and that's going to be the false bottom. Think about that homebrew mash tun that we looked at as well. Oftentimes, though, that false bottom is not going to have small holes like this, like the homebrew mash tun does, but it's going to have a series of very thin cuts in the stainless steel. All right. So yeah, this is really where the brew day starts. This is where we are adding hot water or hot liquor and the grain and the malt. Sometimes the general term they'll use for it is grist, because sometimes you're adding things that aren't malt, whether they're adjuncts or other things like that. So sometimes they'll say the grist or the grist bill that goes into the mash tun. All right. So this is really where the magic starts happening, and I think it's one of the cool things. I think it's one of the really cool things about the process, and we're going to start getting a feel for that as we start shifting away from extract brewing into kind of a mini mash steep. The next beer that we brew is going to be one of these beers where I attempt to show you that when people say they don't like hoppy beer, what they're really saying is they don't like bitter beer. And so what we're going to be doing is we're going to make an extract beer, and we will steep some specialty grains. So it'll kind of be a next step, right? And then we're going to make it really, really hoppy, all right? But we're going to try to push a lot of flavor and aroma, and not a tremendous amount of bitterness, all right? So that's going to kind of be what the idea is with this second beer that we brew. But anyhow, that's the mash tun. 2 examples of it. The third step of this objective of brew house operation says boiling the extracted material, or boiling the wort with hops to add flavor and aroma, and you should also say bitterness, and to sterilize the wort. Okay, that's a key right there. Because as you know, boiling things will sterilize, right? But you're also going to be adding hop flavor, bitterness, and aroma. It says the fourth step is the removal of undesired volatile substance and separation of residual material. So what that means is that as you boil, and we'll do this, we might combine. We're going to be using Pilsner malt in your lab this week, and Pilsner malt has a really raw character to it, kind of a green character. And what we'll do is we'll get you to convert that mash, and we might have to put a couple of, because I'm going to have several teams doing that, and then we'll combine that wort and we'll smell it. And then we'll take a portion of it and boil it for a while and see if we can smell some of those volatiles coming off. We want to drive some of those raw, undesirable characters out of it. All right. And then the fifth step is aerating the wort, usually injecting it with pure O2 and cooling it to an appropriate temperature to add yeast. Okay. So that's really the heart and soul. We walked through the whole process there very generally. The part we're going to be focusing on is milling and mashing today, but I wanted to touch kind of on that entire process, and so we can kind of follow on with it right there. If you would go ahead and take a look at the picture of milled malt that I have supplied for you in the description. I'm drinking hot cocoa, by the way. In this picture, you're going to see it's a good crush. All right. If you're looking at this and if you zoom in on it, you're going to see a little bit of whole kernel, but not that much. What you're going to see is a lot of husk that's pretty much intact. All right. And the less shredded that husk is, the better filtration you're going to have in your grain bed. You're going to see some powder. You're going to see some small little chunks, some small little white chunks of starch ready to be converted. That's a really nice crush. When you start going a lot finer than that, sometimes people feel as if they can get more sugar out of it and different things like that. I think you can kind of hit a point of diminishing returns with a lot of standard systems. And I think you're actually better off going a little bit more coarse than a little bit too fine. You do not want to see a whole bunch of whole malt, whole kernels in there. But you also don't want to just be powdering it to bejesus either, because you're going to lose the ability to transfer water through that, all right, as you attempt to rinse as much sugar out as you can. All right. Let's move along to page 123 and question number 3 when it says, what is the mashing process? It says the mashing is a continuation, and I think this is interesting. We touch on this a little bit with some of the stuff that we've been talking about with malt, where mashing is a continuation of the biochemical changes that start during malting, particularly germination. All right? During mashing, brewing water or liquor, usually hot liquor, is, as it is known in the brewery, is added to the grist. Jump down a little bit in that paragraph down to mashing has a direct impact on the final product because it fixes the original gravity, meaning it determines how much sugar, how dense the sugar is going to be in solution, and sets the ratio of fermentable and unfermentable sugar. Right? There's one more concept that I want you to add right here. This is the step where starch is converted to sugar. And you can refer to that as saccharification. Okay. And this is the big point. So this is when you are blending hot water or hot liquor with the grist, and you want to hit a temperature range, and we're going to talk about that. In a certain temperature range, that starch is going to be converted into sugar. All right? And then it also can have an impact on what type of sugars are produced as well. You can produce a lot of very fermentable sugar, meaning that you'll have a very dry beer, or you can produce a lot of unfermentable sugar, meaning that you will be producing a beer that has higher residual sweetness and potentially and more body. All right? Let's jump along a little bit further into starting to explain why this starch is getting converted into sugar. It's not we're not going to go crazy deep into the chemical side of what's happening right here, but we're going to have a functional understanding of what happens. And we're going to start with number 10 right here. And you can also pull up the alpha amylase enzyme picture that I have. I don't know if it's helpful, but it looks cool. And it can give you a little bit of an idea of what's going on with this process. Starting on question 10 with what are enzymes? Enzymes are proteins with an important role in nature. They catalyze biochemical reactions, which means they enable a reaction to occur quickly at the temperature of living organisms. All right. So what they are is they are a catalyst. And what a catalyst does helps to facilitate a reaction. The reaction that we're looking to have happen in the Mash Tun is saccharification, or the conversion of starch into sugar. All right. Jumping down a little bit further into the second paragraph, it's going to start talking to the importance of getting your mash into the right temperature range. Okay? If you're too low, too high, you can end up in a difficult situation. About third sentence in the second paragraph. However, the chain is relatively fragile. When it's talking about the chain, it's talking about the enzymes. However, the chain is relatively fragile and can be damaged by excessive heat, agitation, or a chemical attack. When the shape of the enzyme change has been damaged so that the enzyme is rendered incapable of creating a reaction or catalyzing a reaction, the enzyme is said to be denatured. All right? There's going to be two enzymes that we're looking at here, and they're alpha and beta amylase. All right? They each have a temperature range where they work best, and also the warmer they are in their acceptable usage range, the faster they work. All right. Jumping down a little bit further, just to back that up, it's the last couple sentences in question number 10 is what are enzymes? Enzymes catalyze reactions more quickly as the temperature increases. However, they are also denatured by heat, so to reach a peak of activity just before they are destroyed. All right. So now we're going to understand why this is important after we start diving a little bit further into alpha and beta amylase. Looking into question number 11, we're specifically going to start with alpha amylase, and follow along here. Alpha amylase is the enzyme responsible for randomly breaking large, complex starch molecules into smaller, soluble molecules. It is stable in hot, watery mashes. When it says watery, it means that there would be more water. The ratio of water to grain would be higher. So can convert starch to soluble sugars over a wide range of temperatures. Although above 158 degrees Fahrenheit, it is rapidly denatured. Calcium is commonly added to a mash as a cofactor and to provide better stability at higher temps. We talked briefly about some of the positive effects of making sure you have an appropriate amount of calcium in your brewing water. There's several of them, and a lot of it goes on here in the mash. Making sure that your mash will clarify the way you want it to, that you get conversion as quickly as you want, and different things like that. So alpha amylase is going to be creating kind of these long chain, more dextrinous sugars. Okay, what we mean by that is if you mash your grain in the high 150s, there's going to be more residual sugar left in the beer because it leaves behind long chain sugars that are not fermentable by brewer's yeast or by traditional brewer's yeast. All right. Let's flip that along with beta amylase. Beta amylase is the other mash enzyme capable of degrading starch or converting starch to sugar. Through its action, it is the enzyme largely responsible for creating large amounts of fermentable sugar in wort. It works at its optimal rate at about 131 to 140, but like all enzymes, it works at its greatest rate just before it is destroyed. Thus, at 149 Fahrenheit, it is much less effective. Jumping down a little bit further in the paragraph, if the mash is allowed to stand at a temperature that favors the action of beta amylase, the wort will be more fermentable, just to kind of back up what we were saying before. Changing the mash temperature from 149 to 156 can raise the beer's terminal gravity. All right, and it gives an example of the change in density. This is, I think you can have some interesting conversations with this concept of alpha and beta amylase. I know there's a lot of brewers that are very big proponents of believing that you can generate large amounts of change in a beer by how warm or cool you mash it, relatively cool. I think you can, the general range that people hit, they're going to hit somewhere between 147 degrees and like 159 degrees. And what that temperature range will do is those enzymes are going to overlap. They're going to be able to be active kind of in a range, all right? They may work a little faster or a little slower depending on what that temperature range is. But a lot of times people are mashing in kind of that 152 to 153 range, that mid-range spot, which will give you a blend of fermentable and non-fermentable sugars, respectively, from both of those enzymes. And this is the thing where some people might really disagree with me. Um, I am a bigger proponent of adjusting the body of the mash and the residual sweetness of the mash with recipe development. Okay. Um, I don't believe. I think you can make. I think if you really want to drive body in a beer, um, I think there's ways that you can do that with recipe that almost bulletproof you a little bit, rather than hoping that the mash is going to get it done. I believe that the mash is a factor in generating what types of sugars are in there, but I believe that the brewer also has the opportunity to manipulate that final beer with the things that are going into the grist and into the kettle. All right. For instance, if you want a lighter bodied beer, all right. If you want a lighter bodied beer, you can go ahead and mash in that mid range, and actually remove base malt from the recipe, because what you're doing is when you remove malt from a recipe, you're removing eventual sugar, right? And so you're substituting malt sugar with like table sugar, dextrose, or something like that, which is completely fermentable. All right, that's one way that sugar will completely go away, and it will be completely fermented, and then you will have a lighter bodied beer. Okay, so that's one example of how you can tweak a beer on the recipe side to manipulate the final body. Another example of how you can increase the body of a beer is with adjuncts, and we haven't dove into adjuncts all that much, but adjuncts are non-malt constituents to a grist, non-malt additions to a grist. I'm a very big believer that you can take something like flaked rye. I'm not talking about rye malt here, because that's a different animal. I think you can take flake products, oats, rye, in particular rye, and I think you can fold rye into a beer to increase the viscosity of the finished beer. All right, and really adjusting viscosity of something is really dialing up the body or dialing down the body. All right, so let's say that we can combine these two concepts. So would there be a situation where you would want to add simple sugar to a beer so it ferments out low, but then add flaked rye to it to increase the body? I think so, because it's one of the ways that you can give a fuller tasting beer and still have it be refreshing and easy to drink, right? We've kind of talked about in class when we were talking about saison. When you pull down the amount of sugar left in a beer, it can almost make it more drinkable and more refreshing. But if you want to also have that thing where it has some nice body too, I think flaked rye is a really good way to do that. I folded 23% of my mash with flaked rye before, and it's given me a very nice body and a very dry beer. And so I don't want to go off on too much of a tangent, but I think it's one of the things that's really exciting about what we do as brewers is the mash is one way where you can affect the final balance of a beer, how dry it's going to get. But there's other knobs you can turn for that as well, which I think is really cool. We'll be diving into that stuff more as we go. But anyways, that's really going to be the nuts and bolts. I want you guys to have an understanding of kind of what wort production is, that first step, the adding of hot water or liquor to the grist, giving it time to convert. That's one thing we didn't mention. The text doesn't mention this, and I know different people. It's a good look. Different brewers have different thought processes on this, and I might be a little bit more aggressive than different brewers. But one of the keys to this mash process is whether you're doing it at home or professionally. What you do is you get all of your grain, your grist, and hot liquor mixed. So you have this kind of soupy, watery oatmeal thing going on, and then you recirculate it. If you were to pull that picture up of the professional style mash tun, what you would do is you would be pulling the clear wort from underneath the false bottom and pumping it back up and dispersing it on top of the mash bed again. And you would do that until the wort ran clear, meaning that there was no more grain or anything that you could see in there. It's one of the ways you can create a clear wort. It helps to make a more stable beer the further you go through the process. Some brewers will wait, they will mash in, and they will let their mash rest for an hour. Some people will let their mash rest for an hour and a half. I am firmly convinced that that is not necessary. If it makes the brewer feel good and comfortable, that's not something that I'm making fun of one bit, because a brewer being comfortable with their process, I think, is important. And sometimes it could also be when they're achieving other tasks to prep for the brew day. So that's fine. That rest period is fine. I'm a big believer, though, that with the highly modified malt that we have today, that starch is converted to sugar far sooner than a lot of us expect. Dr. Michael Lewis, which is one of my big-time brewing science man crushes, he's out at UC Davis, their brewing program. He basically says as soon as you finish mashing in, doughing in, whatever you want to call it, he says you can pretty much start recirculating it. All right, start trying to generate that clear wort. Pardon me, that was an ugly cough. If I were in a situation, because right now I use the processes that my brewery ownership wants to use, which is no problem, I would start testing that, and I would start pushing that lower. The lowest I've ever taken that down is given a 15-minute rest. I think we're going to push that low when we actually start doing an all-grain day in class, and actually find out, how quickly we can get that thing to convert. So, anyways, that was just kind of one portion that I neglected to mention. As always, please let me know if you have any questions or anything like that. Hit me up by email. If you haven't been getting those assignments in, there are a handful of you who have not. You really need to do that stuff. It's gonna torpedo your grade. All right. I'm looking forward to class this week. I think it's gonna be to our lab. I think it's gonna be pretty exciting, pretty fun, and yeah. Until next time.